disinformation today is actually the only way Israel's narrative can retain a small part of what it used to be. It's actually the very opposite, and everyone knows that.
And let's just call it plainly, right? This is propaganda. Welcome back to The Tea with me, Myriam François, where we dig beneath the headlines to reveal the real forces shaping our world. Before we dive in, make sure to hit subscribe so you never miss an episode of The Tea. If you want to support the show and help shape future episodes, join our Patreon community. Think of it as the resistance. Plus, if you're in our top tier, you'll get access to ad-free episodes. The link's in our bio. 2 years. That's how long a genocide on an unimaginable scale has unfolded right before our eyes. Israeli aggression hasn't just killed tens of thousands in Gaza, it's redrawn the whole Middle East map. Old regimes are gone, new players have risen, and the rules of the international game have forever changed. The US once spent billions and thousands of lives exporting democracy. Now that democracy itself is under siege back in Washington, where authoritarianism is running the show. On this grim anniversary, understanding the seismic shifts is more urgent than ever. To unpack the consequences of 2 years of relentless Israeli violence from Gaza to Tehran, Damascus and beyond, I'm joined by Professor Bassam Haddad, founding director of George Mason University's Middle East and Islamic Studies program, co-founder of Jadaliyya, author of Business Networks in Syria, The Political Economy of Authoritarian Resilience, and an upcoming second Syria book titled Understanding the Syrian Calamity, Regime Opposition, Outsiders. He's also my former professor at Georgetown. Today's conversation explores the regional devastation, the domestic fallout, and whether, as some have suggested, this marks the dying throes of Zionism. Bassam, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Myriam.
Thank you so much for being here. Appreciate it. It's been a minute.
Yes, it has been, although it doesn't feel like it.
It really doesn't. So thank you for joining us. I guess my first question to you is, obviously you're teaching in Washington, D.C., which looks rather different to the city that I was studying in a little while ago now. It's now heavily militarized. You've got these National Guard troops, armed federal officers, military vehicles flooding the streets. Hundreds of federal law enforcement officers have been deployed under Trump's orders, to address what he calls complete and total lawlessness. I knew DC was bad, but complete and utter lawlessness. And that strategy has now been extended to other cities, right? We're seeing it in LA, Memphis, Portland, Chicago, and beyond. We also just saw him reinstate the death penalty in DC. What is the mood in DC right now?
Well, indeed, yes, it's quite ominous. And without taking away from the repression that's taking place in cities like DC and elsewhere, on university campuses, on the streets, I just want to start by saying we cannot squarely pin things on the current leadership, on either the Republicans or even Trump. So a good perspective to have is to recognize that this is sort of what has been going on for many years in the United States, but on acid. It's exacerbated by Trump, by a particular mood that pervades most of, if you will, white America, and in conjunction with various, privileged upper classes and moguls and so on. But it has started way before. And if we want to connect this to the genocide Israel's committing, it's the Democrats that have actually set the table and set the stage for what is going on right now, or what's continuing right now. So as we address what's going on right now, it shouldn't be squarely pinned on a particular person or a party, just like Israel's crimes cannot be pinned on Netanyahu. So with that perspective, yes, it is actually something that we haven't seen on the streets. Beyond the campus repression, this is something that is new, and it signals a lot of things, which I'm assuming we will talk about, not least the direct assault on what is left of democracy, if you will, because we can talk a lot about whether we had it well in terms of democracy, and I don't think we did at various levels. But this assault is direct. it is actually literally scary. And it is something that harkens back, for some of us who lived in various parts of the world, including in the Middle East, harkens back to the kinds of mood and fear that was palpable and that we felt when, for instance, I was crossing, as I was doing my dissertation in the 1990s, crossing into Syria. The way I felt about going into Syria, given my research on Syria that you mentioned, I'm probably going to feel the same way going back into the United States. And as perhaps not to the same degree, but it is the kind of feeling that I never thought we would have in the United States. And this is coming from a privileged person. So we have to also acknowledge that what's happening is actually harming the most vulnerable segments of the population in the United States, with exceptions, of course. But we have to recognize that there is a class component to this, there is a race component to this, and it's the kind of thing that when you said walking around DC, if someone, looked like you, for instance, you wouldn't have to worry. If I walked in DC, I have to be ready with my passport, with my ID, and so on, because I actually might be picked up or questioned.
And you're the American citizen and I'm not, right?
Oh, yeah.
And this is the wildest
part. It's not about citizenship.
Let me ask you about, you've studied autocracy, you've lived and worked under autocracies in your research, as you just mentioned. What parallels do you see between some of the autocratic systems that you have studied and, lived and worked under, and the new permutation of American democracy?
Well, again, I would caution against thinking that we're at a point where we are level with the kind of autocracies that exist around the world. Despite one's profound critique of the United States, for the most part, we're still way from that sort of situation. Not for some people. For some people, it's very much that situation. But structurally, we are still far from that moment. However, in relative terms, for people who have never experienced this, I was just speaking with someone who actually is horrified. And we're talking about here in the UK, so it's also very similar.
Yes.
And yes, if this is your context, you would be horrified because you are not used to it. When I was in the Middle East, I expected certain things.
Right.
Here, people did not. Here and in the United States, people did not expect this sort of ubiquitous fear that takes place when you are trying to do something as rational and as moral and ethical as protesting genocide. So you are witnessing something that for people living only in this context is akin to authoritarianism. And the practice every day, for instance, what's happening in Oregon and now potentially in Chicago, and what's happened in DC and other places, is actually horrifying to people. And it's the kind of thing that begins to uncover what actually has been going on in the United States, which is now basically out in the open.
So we're talking today the same week as the anniversary of October the 7th, and you were just talking there about sort of the types of repression that we're unaccustomed to in a Western context. But we've heard from our Prime Minister here in the UK, Keir Starmer, this week, that it's un-British for people to protest against the genocide this week. What do you make of this equivalence that we are hearing from Starmer, but also, I suppose, from other leaders, where there's a sort of nationalism that's coming through the discourse, where it's as if protesting against the genocide is something that those foreign people outside of us do, and that the real patriots, presumably say nothing?
Well, to begin with, these leaders / elected, officials or appointed officials or presidents and what have you, have to contend with the fact that their public has actually shifted positions. So on the one hand, we are talking about people that no longer represent the populace, at least at this point, if not when they were elected or when they were able to, make those claims in conjunction with popular support. I think those comments are more a way to protect themselves on the one hand, and second, to use what is happening, quote unquote, on the streets, which is actually not something that's out of the ordinary in cases where you're protesting genocide, to actually use it as a bat to bring down these protests, but also other things that are and have always been on the table, including migrants, including other questions of instability, because the larger picture here is that the status quo, the larger quote unquote liberal status quo, liberal as in liberal democracies that basically are a camouflage for a particular sort of domination, which had a nice veneer, and now the veneer is being taken off. So what
Is
we
that
are
a good thing or a bad thing that the veneer's gone?
That's a very good question. Those of us who have been, as you probably know from our encounter 20 years ago or so, I've always been talking about liberalism as an issue, and students would be like, "Why? Freedoms and all these good things come together, and this is a positive context." And I would always address the powers, economic and political and class-based, that are behind what we are seeing. And once this is threatened, there will be action in ways that we haven't actually predicted or expected, at least if you are not, paying attention. And what we are seeing right now is the unfolding of this. So we are seeing a shift, not just on Palestine. So the 60% or 70% of Americans that now oppose what Israel is doing, or the 40% that basically do call what's happening in Gaza genocide, this is not just about Palestine. Regardless of the fact that Palestine, for me and for many people, is the actual biggest moral question of our time or cause, this is also about the rolling back / assault on what is left of democracy. And we have to assert, we are not seeing an attack on democracy. We're seeing an attack on what is left of democracy in the United States, and I presume in the UK, but others can speak on this in a manner that I probably can't as well.
No, and I think there's unfortunately, we're not far behind you here in the UK in terms of this sort of unmasking of the real foundations of power in this country, which for a long time did have very good PR, I guess we could put it.
Absolutely.
I want to ask you, because I want to talk on this particular show because of the anniversary of the genocide, 2 years into this, I really wanted to take us back to some of the momentous moments over the past 2 years. And one of them, of course, was the US campus protests, starting, of course, with Columbia, which became a focal point when the university administration unleashed police on their students in what were really shocking images of, students protesting a genocide being brutalized on their own campus. Since then, many students and staff have faced repercussions, right? They've been sacked. There's been a purge. Let's be honest, there's been a purge. Can you give us a sense of the state of academic freedoms, or should I say academic restrictions, as they're occurring today on US campuses, which it's worth saying were for a long time lauded as some of the best institutions for learning in the world?
It's actually extremely scary to be in a university in the United States today if you have a problem with annihilation, starvation, mass killing, and the kinds of things that we are witnessing in Gaza, because this is actually the fulcrum of the issue. This is a campaign that has started decades ago. The assault on higher education is something that we have lived with for decades. It's been actually sometimes, under the radar, but not always. So what we are seeing because we've seen the expulsion and the firing of people like Stephen Salaita and many others. We've seen the curtailing of academic freedom. But what we are seeing today is a completely naked form of repression by university administrators, unfortunately sometimes aided by some faculty members and, of course, university presidents, because the context within which this is occurring is beyond the assault on academic freedom or on higher education by certain quote-unquote right-wing groups. And I say this because there's also collaboration with other sorts of groups that are not politically right-wing, classically speaking, but they actually oppose freedom of speech on certain issues, such as Israel-Palestine. So they actually join in that campaign in an out way. So what we are seeing today is new in the sense that university administrators, presidents and all, have kind of become an extension of state power and actually executing state initiatives within the university setting, either because they comport with the same sort of politics, values, fears, concerns, or because they actually themselves want to maintain their positions and are playing along. In all cases, on the receiving end, faculty, staff, and students have been subject to a campaign in the United States in the past couple of years that is literally horrific compared to what these people thought they were in. This bastion, maybe the last bastion supposedly of freedom in a post-capitalist and post-industrial society that is supposedly democratic like the United States. And in many ways, that position, that feeling that we all have is exacerbated by the fact that there's another current that's taking place that addresses the fears that the dominant powers, classes, race, if you will, is feeling towards the nature of the country. Hence the question of migration, of deportations, and so on. So there's a couple of things that are coming together to silence people, especially students, and especially the most vulnerable among faculty. Not all faculty has the same level of vulnerability, given some are on contracts or adjuncts or not tenured. So this is a complex issue, but it is happening and it is likely to increase, in my view, not because it's not bad yet, but also because you're seeing a situation today of repression on campus while Israel is committing genocide. So the repression is taking place with the knowledge that we're essentially defending a genocide, and we are, of course, complicit in it in the United States. Imagine what might happen when the genocide subsides or, is reduced, because I think aspects of it will always continue and always have existed. Imagine the kind of boldness that will take place, because they'll be able to say to the protesters, what are you protesting? The genocide is quote unquote over, when in reality it's not. And that's the whole problem. We ignore the context within which the attacks of October 7th has taken place, not to justify everything that happened, but to understand history.
Which surely is the context of university studying, is to understand, not justify, understand.
Absolutely. This is the idea. To understand matters, just like we look at all sorts of historical contexts and backgrounds to understand what happened in order to treat it, not to justify it. But the last thing I want to say, which is for me a very important point, and that is what we are seeing on campus today was actually started, developed, and deepened by the previous administration under the Democratic Party.
It's an important correction, because I do think there is a tendency to kind of lay all the blame at the feet of Trump in particular.
Yeah.
Let me ask you about what's it like teaching about Palestine, teaching about the conflict on a campus today. I know that you've recently set up an incredible platform, which I highly recommend that our audience check out. It's called Palestine in Context, which is an educational platform with tutorials, articles, teach-ins. It's absolutely fantastic. It's so needed. But I did, look at it thinking, why doesn't this exist under the auspices of a Middle East Studies department? So what's it like trying to teach this topic at this time, and where does this platform fit into that?
Teaching Palestine Today is the title of our new series.
Oh, wow.
Which has aired so far about 4 episodes, and it's continuing. It addresses the idea that if you want to teach Palestine today, you shouldn't actually waver on the truth, but you should recognize that there are different ways or different languages or different terms that you can use in order to protect yourself and protect your job without compromising on addressing the genocide and the annihilation that's taking place and who's responsible for it and how we're complicit and connected to it. So it actually addresses these things so that educators can protect themselves, but also to recognize that we are in a situation where you could be picked up because you're a low-hanging fruit because of what you say in the classroom. Again, especially the most vulnerable among us. Same thing with the students. So one has to actually address the question of teaching Palestine today in a forum where people for the first time, probably need to worry about things that they never worried about. Not that teaching Palestine was an open game historically, but it is now actually a dangerous act. Now, the project of Gaza in Context is a collaborative project of 24 units started right after, about October 15th of 2023, and actually brings together 24 units and research centers in some of the more active universities worldwide, particularly in America. And it is based basically on the collaboration of all sorts of departments that are Middle East departments for the most part. So it is grounded in those. But of late, we have been under a lot of pressure by some departments, not always because they themselves don't support what the project is doing, but because they are being put under so much pressure by their administrators and probably outside voices that we are now being very careful in terms of questions of sponsorship, because people are trying to protect their departments.
Let me ask you about something that's doing the rounds at the moment, Bassam, which is this interview between Ezra Klein and Ta-Nehisi Coates on, the New York Times podcast. It's doing the rounds, I think, because of the profound moral questions that it's asking about some of the issues we've just talked about, which is the state of, I don't know, what do we call it? Fascism, autocracy, you tell me, in America today. How do we respond to it? And I think the reason that, there are many reasons why the interview is kind of blown up on the internet, but it's partly because of the differing stances that, Ezra and Ta-Nehisi take on this issue, right? There's a sort of accommodationist stance that we're seeing some people take, not just Ezra, many people, and I observed that a lot of them are either white or white adjacent. And then, Coates's view is, a little bit more like, how do you begin negotiating with people who don't see you as human, which of course, as an African American man, he is not unfamiliar with. This is not news to him. For you as an Arab American, how do you negotiate this? Do you think that there is an accommodation to be had with the people in power, with the MAGA camp? Or is there a line that needs to be towed that we don't cross in communicating, in negotiating, in accommodating?
I think in general, this interview, just like we are seeing in many spaces, we're seeing basically the remnants of a liberal order, people like Ezra, addressing somebody who has a critical perspective, either because of the background or because of their political stance, even though, of course, Quotes had changed positions, right? So even in that case, there has been a shift. So that opposition is now out in the open, because prior there was a liberal veneer, and when the liberal veneer has actually shattered, and Palestine shattered that veneer, it also shattered the pretense of certain what is called Western values, on which we had a teaching recently on Teaching Palestine Today on Western values. What happened to Western values during this Israel-led genocide that is supported by the United States, the UK, and many other Western countries, despite all of their proclamations and gestures, which I think we might talk about.
Yeah.
So yes, for me personally, as somebody living in the United States, I have been witnessing those things. I have been saying those things for as long as you remember, and
yeah.
Unfortunately for me, about 10 years prior, and we were considered left-wing nuts. I was called actually in one of the universities I taught, like there's this left-wing nut talking about democracy in the United States as not just imperfect, but of course I was going way beyond that, but they were basically aghast that I would critique Western democracy when we have, authoritarian rule, pervading most or many of the developing countries, including the Middle East. And now that cover is actually blown, and you will actually be seeing the defenders of the status quo that pretend to actually represent those values when those values are being denied every day by the people and the powers they are defending. So what the answer to your question is that no, a confrontation is going to happen, and we cannot just sit and say we just want to have dialogue. We will continue with the dialogue, of course, but there are limits, as Coates shared, and I think I would put some of these limits even beyond what Coates has addressed.
Where would you put it?
I think that it is really time, for instance, from basic small things such as interviews, for people just to act properly and really go after arguments that are essentially racist, sexist, or classist and politically exploitative. in a way that, for instance, some hardball shows like we've seen in the UK do. Most of our public debates, even sometimes on NPR, National Public Radio, do not rise to the level of serious questioning of power. So even at that level, this has to actually become ubiquitous, but also in public spaces, at universities, and we're asking simply for courageously and boldly addressing issues.
Real
so we
questions.
are way beyond. We're not addressing something that actually requires any violation, by the way, of the law. This is for civil disobedience, and people can do all sorts of things of that sort. But before we even get there, there is a huge arena to fill in terms of having a serious and accountable debate.
I mean, the real questions issue is one I think that's increasingly posed here as well, partly because of some of the compromises that we think legacy media are making to accommodate the shift in the administration. You mentioned NPR. I mean, wasn't it one of the journalists at NPR recently was being mocked by Trump on his plane, basically saying to him, you won't be here for much longer. Public broadcasting, for all of the criticism that we may have of some of its current output, and certainly I've been a huge critic of the BBC's output, particularly on the genocide in Gaza. But, without public broadcasting, we're essentially left with like a bunch of millionaires with pet projects for their usually, political ambitions. It's not like it's quite dystopian if we remove public broadcasting from the picture. Let me just ask you quickly about something that Ezra said about the US right now being in the midst of what he termed a cold civil war. Would you agree with that?
No, because it's not so cold. And it's definitely not something that is taking place behind the scenes. It's very bold, it's very direct, it's naked, and it's likely to get worse even if a Trump administration passes. And the fact that a lot of people are not in the streets every day, not just about Palestine, but about all sorts of other things, also shows that against the grain of people saying, oh, the US is over, democracy is gone, it does show that there is support, not necessarily for every single thing that is happening right now under Trump, because even supporters of Trump kind of rolled their eyes here and there.
Yeah.
But there is support for the essential core of what is happening, the idea that the United States needs to return to whatever it is that the United States was, which is, in my view, a whiter, male, masculine-oriented, classist, and somewhat of a racist past. That return to that sort of thing, which is, of course, described in better terms by those who support it, is not something that is entirely opposed by a huge number of voters in the United States.
And I think the role of the media in this is a significant one. We just touched on this idea that, the tough questions, the real questions aren't always or really being asked in many cases about what this discourse, as you refer to it, is actually about. What is it that people are truly harking after? And I want to ask you about this incident that's also doing the rounds on social media right now, which is when the US, Van Jones, you would have seen him. He was recently on the HBO show Real Time with Bill Maher. He referred to online videos showing casualties in Gaza as a disinformation campaign by Iran and Qatar. He also, made fun of dying babies in Gaza, which of course is hilarious comedy. To whom is the question? Two questions. How did we get to a point where people like Van Jones can make these sorts of gags and an entire audience will laugh at them? But also, can you touch on this question of disinformation a little bit?
Well, on the first question, it's about location. That was the Bill Maher show. And on the Bill Maher show, these sorts of things will pass as jokes, as funny, as basically the norm, right? Because comedy, supposedly, and what we witness in comedy is about fall from grace. On that show, this can pass. Of course, it's not just insensitive, it's almost criminal, because not just because the joke is basically in horrible taste, but because we are actually supporting the killing of babies on the ground in Gaza. So that makes it actually, even though the Van Jones probably was intending something else, but he did it at the expense of what we are actually supporting on a daily basis in Gaza. So it's disgusting in various ways. Now, the question of disinformation, which is a larger question, because even if he didn't make that joke, the bigger issue is the idea that there is disinformation that is in favor of the Palestinian cause. This is actually sort of an alternative reality. This is so ridiculous that sometimes it's not worth responding to, but we make the mistake of not responding to it because we would be assuming that, the powers are on our side. The powers are not on our side. So you need to respond to it. You need to address it. The truth is that the Israeli narrative has lost. Even The Economist, which holds views on things like the genocide and the invasion of Iraq in 2003 that are abominable. Even The Economist titled its cover recently, How Israel is Losing America, right? So what is happening is that Israel is losing America and losing, of course, the UK in terms of popular support and beyond, because it shattered its own narrative of victimhood in the streets of Gaza. It killed its own narrative in Gaza by actually annihilating Gaza and destroying almost completely. We're talking about almost near complete destruction of Gaza to make it uninhabitable, which is the main cause of what has been the reason that this is happening. It's way above the question, or other than the question of hostages or the human shields and the idea that we are dealing with Hamas. All of these buzzwords. It's really about population. Ethnic cleansing, transfer, and replacement with the kind of things that has been happening. So we are seeing a kind of, horrific development of or expansion of genocide in different ways via ethnic cleansing, via illegal settlements, and so on. And people here are trying to make it look like it's the Palestinian cause that is benefiting from disinformation. The disinformation today is actually the only way Israel's narrative can retain a small part of what it used to be. It's actually the very opposite, and everyone knows that. Every single structural, corporate, mainstream media outlet is actually regurgitating the Israeli narrative with some punctuation of the alternative. So what Van Jones and others are saying are just talking points that are very easily debunked by a 12-year-old.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the what you've just said there, which is this idea that the disinformation is actually very actively being pushed by Israel. So TikTok, which became a key platform, of course, on which a lot of young people began to be educated about what was really happening in Gaza. It's now been placed, its US operations, at least under Oracle, which is led by executives with strong pro-Israel ties who reportedly censor pro-Palestinian content. At the same time, major media and tech firms are facing growing pressure to suppress dissent on Palestine, which is fueled by Israel-linked investment in AI and digital moderation. We've seen this with ChatGPT in particular most recently. We know that Israel's foreign ministry is spending $150 million in 2025 on media campaigns, including on US campuses. To what extent do you think that the gains that have been made at the polls, the shifts that you're talking about, can be reversed by the sheer amount of money being pumped into propaganda? And let's just call it plainly, right? This is propaganda.
Yes, and one of the positive things that's happening is that not just people like you and myself are recognizing it as such, but the level of destruction and annihilation that's taking place by Israel with our support is now obvious to the American, I would say the American middle. Whether or not they support it, it is obvious. The starvation is obvious. So what is happening right now is, in light of this, in light of losing your own base, whether it's Democratic and increasingly Republican, let alone the new generation or the Gen Z that we are observing having been against this from the get-go. It's because of this advancement of this alternative narrative that asserts Palestinians' rights, even though I'm not crazy about the word rights, because there's a lot more here to that than just a question of rights. Sometimes it's about existence and so on. it's because of that advancement that Israel needs to go, and its supporters need to go to the next level to actually purchase support. And the interesting thing that we are seeing in social media, if you are, following what's happening in terms of people in social media receiving funding, like actual funding for their posts and so on.
$6,000 to $7,000 per post.
Yeah.
$7,000 per post.
Yeah, or intervention or podcast or so on. What is happening is that Israel has lost the narrative, or its narrative, to the point where they have to purchase their support. This is a very important indicator of what can be called the last phase of Zionism, which of course is not something that we are going probably to see, in the next couple of years, but it is something structural that is taking place from which you cannot go back.
Let me ask you now a little bit about this moment that we're in, and kind of there are certain moments in history that feel like they will mark a generation. And to me, the flotilla, the global flotilla, the Sumud flotilla, this fleet of boats that sought to sail to Gaza with aid, and in which we saw, Greta Thunberg and the grandson of Nelson Mandela and many, many others being arrested, detained, feels like one of those moments, which incidentally was hardly covered by much of legacy media. We've also seen things like, the call for FIFA to exclude Israel, major divestments such as Norway, or in this country, a big supermarket chain called the Co-op, which is also divested. We've seen campaigns to boycott Eurovision if Israel participates. What's your sense of kind of how historic these moments are and how significant they are in the wider movement to support Palestinian liberation?
I am very pleased to see that unusual suspects are actually making the same statements or very similar statements to so many of us who have actually been advocating for liberation of Palestine and Palestinians. And that is a function of the kind of dynamic that I addressed, the removal of the veneer, which, by the way, it's also important if you are tracing when that actually happened at a sort of, snowballing effect. It happened only after March 2025, which is very recent. We're October right now. And that took place after the ceasefire was violated by Israel, and it was no longer a guessing game as to who violated the ceasefire, as opposed to prior periods when people would believe any reports that Hamas has actually violated the ceasefire. So what we are seeing is the removal of this veneer, that after the ceasefire was broken by Israel and it was ascertained even to the mainstream viewer, we began to see a shift. And we also began to see the coincidence of this shift in popular opinion with the rise of a segment of the MAGA movement who no longer is buying into the kind of America first profession, when it seems like for them it's Israel first.
Yeah, and we hear this a lot online.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And once people like Marjorie Taylor Greene and Tucker Carlson and others, we talk about these folks because they are very much in the limelight, but others, once they actually made that switch, you began to see a barrage, a snowballing across the board. And of course, Hollywood has always been, waiting to actually share, because I know personally from a lot of people who know celebrities who are, you see some of them online, but others want to speak out, but they saw what happened to people like Selena Gomez and others who spoke out early and they were actually cancelled. Now, this is no longer the case.
If you're enjoying the show, why not join our Patreon community? The Tea is more than just a YouTube show. It's a space to foster meaningful change together. By becoming a member, you're supporting that mission. And if you join our top tier, you'll get exclusive ad-free episodes too. So join us now, link in our bio. Let me ask you about the current ceasefire negotiations, because obviously on this week of the anniversary, 2 years in, there couldn't be anything more important for us today than a cessation of the hostilities. How much credence do you give to the current negotiations that are happening in Egypt right now?
That's my response, but I'll unpack it. It's a cliche to say it's a charade, but it is. Everything we are witnessing in terms of the current, ceasefire ceasefire or the peace plan, as is being called, is a form of capitulation. And it's not just led by the United States or Trump and the UK and Israel. It's also led by these Arab states that are actually or according to so many people in the Arab world and beyond, the most shameful of all players, including Israel, because they are supporting this charade, even if they are being violated and humiliated themselves, as in this case, when they actually signed on to a particular peace plan that ended up being revised after Netanyahu went to the United States. They still continued to support it. They haven't raised their voice or pulled out from it. And we are seeing right now the implementation of a plan that wasn't what was actually written. Not that what was written was like, a heavenly and social justice or equity or a rights-based deal. But what is happening right now is actually benefiting Netanyahu, which is why he was bragging about, he can't stop bragging about what he was able to do when he went to the United States, which elicited some reports about Trump is being upset with Netanyahu. Whenever you hear Trump or previously Biden is upset with Netanyahu, you really shouldn't make very much of it.
It's a circus, right?
I mean, even if there is a kind of, if somebody is ticked, it's like being ticked with an ally that you're supporting structurally in all cases.
I mean, Netanyahu literally changed his line standing next to Trump, right? He stood there saying, yeah, I agree to the deal, but there won't be, I'm not going to sign on to the PA, leading, which is like, hold on, that was the deal. That is the deal. You're stood next to Trump and you're going against what you just said you would sign on to. And he said nothing.
It's a naked violation not only of common sense and morality, it's also a naked violation of the time-tested U.S. policy vis-a-vis Israel-Palestine in terms of the question of two states. However, many of us opposed it because of its charade-like approach and sort of camouflaging what is happening on the ground, which is the expansion of apartheid and ethnic cleansing. But first, people, they don't care if it's a charade. Some people, like myself, I just want the killing of human beings and the dehumanization of Palestinians to stop in the manner in the manner that it's been happening.
I mean, if I was in Gaza, probably that might well be my position, right?
And we, as quote unquote scholars, activists, humans looking at Gaza, we should recognize that this is actually in and of itself a positive thing. The issue is what's next and the kinds of things that are being planned by these horrible actors. We used to say unsavory in other words, this is one of the things that we used to say.
Yeah.
Now you have to be able to say what you are observing with these horrible actors, whether in the United States or the UK. Even this talk of recognition of Palestinian state by the UK or many other Western countries is a cover to continue doing what structurally they've been doing all along, which is financing, supporting, and actually sending arms to Israel to continue its genocide and to actually expand and increasing, let alone the actual participation of the UK and the US in various operations behind the scenes or maybe not. And there are a lot of reports about the active participation. So this is, we have to actually not take it very seriously. The only thing that I would take seriously is the potential halting of bombing that's killing civilians, which Netanyahu hasn't actually abided by.
We were talking about the UK just now. We've just heard from a Channel 4 investigation that UK arms exports have spiked this September. So in the midst of the genocide, the UK not only continues to provide arms to Israel in reconnaissance flights, which you also know are ongoing, but increases its arms sales. We've also seen Tony Blair touted, to lead this new kind of interim administration of Gaza. And I want to ask you what you make of the extent of actual UK involvement, because, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I'm under the illusion, perhaps, that no former prime minister of this country is going to lead an initiative of this level of sensitivity in that region without sign-off from this government.
Yeah, I mean, essentially, the UK, just like the US, where the US takes, the prize, are complete partners in this genocide. This is the structural fact which is evidenced by the continuing arms sales, even today when people are being starved and killed in tents after they have been twice, thrice removed from where they're at, and sometimes 5 or 6 times. So there is no question that this reality of complete partnership is what is going on. So everything else that we see is a way to paper over things. People forget that the whole reason this is happening is because of a deep level of dehumanization of Arabs, Palestinians, and Muslims. Whatever their background, they could be Christian, Muslim, atheist, and we have a very large non-religious community in the Arab world. For anybody who knows anything about the history and current social status of Arabs and religion, it doesn't matter. There is a level of dehumanization that makes it acceptable for Palestinians and Arabs and Muslims to be killed on a daily basis. And that also runs among the people that are opposed to what's happening because they feel that it went beyond the thresholds. But it doesn't take away the dehumanization that is part and parcel of the larger collective unconscious of so many people. In the end, this does go back to a situation that we have to address and recognize. The genocidal past of the United States, the colonial savagery of the UK, and we can go to Germany and the Holocaust and other Western countries that are still supporting Israel. So there is that, which should not for a moment distract us from this reality and kind of be sort of swayed by the gestures, whether it's the recognition of a Palestinian state or the statements that are put out here and there. So we have to be, this is basically liberalism versus reality. Now, on the other point of Tony Blair, I mean, it's not just morally preposterous and insulting. It's also insulting to the mind to have somebody like Tony Blair, who actually supported the fraudulent and barbaric invasion of Iraq that led to the killing of more than 1 million people and destroyed a country and brought it back again after 1991 to a previous age, if not several ages prior. It's actually mind-boggling. It's like Marine Le Pen in France running a diversity, equity, and inclusion campaign in France. This is just not something that bodes well for anybody who cares about any form of freedom, liberty, equity, or social justice. Similarly, the existence of some people in this American envoy, including Kushner, is repulsive. Not that everything else is okay, but you are basically seeing it's not even a charade. They're showing you who these people are. The same people that talked about Gaza becoming a resort are now engaging in leading the communication and negotiation in Egypt.
So what is the end goal? Is it a Trump Riviera? I mean, what is the objective here for the UK, the US? Is this really about real estate?
I mean, it could be. I personally am convinced that it is not. I think this is sort of a maximalist, proposition, which, I mean, you never know. It might unfold. But more importantly, and more structurally speaking, a lot of this ultimately is about thinning out the population of Gaza. In my view, from the very beginning, from the moment Israel launched its war of annihilation, which very quickly became evident that it's a form of genocide, the idea was to thin out the population of Gaza. It's not about Hamas. It's not about the hostages. It's not about a response to an attack. It's about a long-standing part of Zionism and the Israeli state, which has been documented since 1948 until today, which is to thin out the population of Palestinians in general, and now in Gaza in particular, through ethnic cleansing, making life uninhabitable, destroying generations and the ability to reproduce. This week there was basically a UN Security Council addressing the question of reproductive rights at the UN, and you actually observe how they're annihilating life altogether. I think these are more important than this, sort of fantasia of resorts. The idea of thinning out Gaza and opening it up for Israeli control, which is precisely what Netanyahu wanted, and he kind of got, because the original peace plan did not actually include some of the provisions that now are included, which allow Israel to actually either stay or have a gray area situation where they can't stay until some conditions are satisfied.
And I saw that even in the current peace deal, there's like 15% that would still be taken, even if Israel did sign up to it. But what I would put to you is what many Israelis put to me, which is they don't want Gaza. I think they might want the West Bank, but they don't want Gaza. They gave up Gaza in 2005. Like, they don't care about Gaza. They already left Gaza. So they would say it's never really been about Gaza.
It's always been about land and demographics in tandem. They never actually wanted Gaza is something that doesn't make sense. The reason they pulled out of Gaza only in terms of military and settlements is not because they don't want Gaza, it's because Gaza became a nuisance. But they continued, of course, as everyone knows, this is actually, we are tired of responding to this talking point. Gaza is under full control of Israel and has been since 2005 under the siege, in a situation where Israel controls the air, the sea, the land. It controls all forms of energy, water. It controls every single record in the registry. They can push buttons to turn off power. They can push buttons to turn off water. They can actually, the level of control over Gaza supersedes actual colonial control that we are accustomed to. So this is like a tired talking point that everyone now is becoming aware of, even those who believed it at some point. The idea has always been ethnic cleansing and ultimate replacement of these people by Israelis.
Let me ask you about the support that we're seeing from the Arab and Muslim world for the peace plan. So we saw Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Turkey, Indonesia, and Pakistan all issue a joint statement welcoming what they call Trump's sincere efforts to end the war in Gaza. Expressing support for reconstruction to prevent displacement, etc. What exactly do these states gain from backing this plan, especially when actually a few of them have also been bombed by Israel lately?
The quick answer is these are Muslim majority states for you, right? This idea that there is some sort of solidarity on the other side by Muslim majority states is actually just as bogus as the recognition of a Palestinian state by the UK. Now, beyond that, we have to recognize that most of these states are run by leaderships that do not represent their populations. In fact, a lot of people say, why aren't Arabs going to the streets like Europeans? Well, because their states have more stringent rules and restrictions on public protest that are deadly, actually. Not just because it's about Palestine. Any form of public protest in many of these states actually represents a threat to these non-representative regimes that are actually usurping their own wealth or the wealth of their own people. So we're also talking about that category of states that are such, whether it's Egypt or many of the Gulf countries and even the non-Arab Muslim majority countries. So there is a kind of lack of fit here when we say these states. It's not the countries and the populations, it's the leaderships. Second, a lot of these states politically are not fans of Palestinian liberation. They're not fans of Palestinian resistance movements. They're not fans of the kind of social justice that we would like to see in Palestine, because they're not even approaching it in their own states.
Name names.
All of them. Every single one of them. Turkey, Indonesia. I'm going to start with the ones that are not usual suspects, not the repressive core like Egypt and Saudi Arabia, but also Indonesia, Turkey, and Pakistan. So there is a kind of shameful participation, because we would expect more, especially of the Arab states. I'm not as concerned as many other people with the word Muslim majority states. These people have hardly ever engaged with the question of Palestine in a consistent manner over the decades. It comes and goes and people feel things. But in the Arab world specifically, these are the shameful states that actually are on board with a process of annihilation that will end up actually touching their
and
own
has been
states.
touching them,
Yeah.
has been touching them very directly. On that note, let me ask you about what's happened to the so-called axis of resistance in the region. For those who are not familiar with the term, we're talking about Iran, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas, and formerly Syria. A lot of people will say that over the last 2 years, that so-called axis of resistance has been dismantled, right? What do you make of that? Has there been a dismantling of the axis of resistance? Does it mean anything for the Palestinians that has happened?
Of course, it means a lot because there was some sort of a deterrence that has been exercised since 2006, at least in Lebanon, with mainly Hezbollah, primarily, of course, Hezbollah in the south and beyond. But yes, it is true. The axis of resistance has been degraded in terms of its power because of, on the one hand, the collapse of the Syrian regime, which actually is not so much of a loss because Iran and Hezbollah were for several years before the collapse, especially after 2019 and 20, unhappy with the role Syria has been playing and its pivot back towards the countries like Saudi Arabia, who are actually financing the uprising in Syria against the regime and against Iran and Hezbollah, who participated, unfortunately, in actually crushing the actual genuine part of the uprising, as well as other parts, because there is the Syrian uprising is Janus-faced. So in a way, yes, there has been a decline, but I don't think there has been a dismantling. I think there is a kind of reformation, but more importantly than the question of Hezbollah in Iran, there is a growing sentiment in the entire region of a kind, and also in Palestine, over and beyond Hamas as well, of a kind of resistance to the degradation, humiliation, and annihilation that's taking place. That is actually going to be a wave of the wave of the future. So whether or not you support the previous existence of the axis of resistance in its own, right at the time, the question of resistance will not end. In fact, there is a concern among people in the United States and also in the Arab world that a more deepened form of resistance will take place. And it's not going to be just about Palestine. It will be like another phase of the Arab uprisings. All of these things are on offer, right? But the actual question of resistance to imperial, imperial plans or designs or existence and wars in the region, yes, that has actually taken a hit, which emboldened Israel to strike Iran and so on and so forth. But we do need to recognize that the Syrian part of this axis of resistance had for long been kind of written off by the other parties, which is Hezbollah and Iran. In fact, Iran, just like Turkey's Erdogan, except for different reasons and motives, had been asking the Syrian regime for several years now to actually try to start talks and negotiations with the opposition in Syria, because they understand well that this is not going to bode well, this kind of pace of stagnation and complete neglect of Syrian society by the former Syrian regime, criminal as it has been, has actually ignored not just Syrian society, but its own actual military force in a way that reduced confidence in it by its own allies, which is one of the reasons why the Syrian regime didn't just, as people say, collapse in a battle. It actually withered, and it's been withering for many years, even after, about 10 years of uprising.
Well, on that note, Syria, I think the Syrian uprising and what occurred, obviously, with the fall of Bashar al-Assad, I think divided many people, I think it's fair to say, including many Syrians. The fall of Bashar was long awaited and I think celebrated, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think that was nearly unanimous. The question of, whether Ahmed al-Sharaa, was the right person to be leading the new Syria is another question, surely, entirely. Do you see much hope in this current moment for the future of Syria? And what concerns, if any, do you have about his leadership in particular? And I say this, of course, in the context that many people will look at him and say, this is someone who used to be by all intents and purposes, an extremist who was associated with Al-Qaeda, who, in the past was also funded in Syria by the CIA. There's lots of sort of murky aspects to this person who now is sort of shaking hands and making jokes with the leader, the head of the CIA in Washington. I mean, it's a very... For a region that has a long history of external intervention, who really is this guy?
Syrians were extremely happy and hopeful early on, and many non-Syrians as well. Most non-Syrians were happy that there was a collapse of a regime that has been beyond brutal. Not at every single moment, because there were ups and downs, but it generally was a brutal regime that was violent, that had the largest per capita number of political prisoners, and that actually has also, beyond those questions, that has actually betrayed its society and engaged in neoliberal economic development that, again, privileged certain people, and I'm not talking about sects, but certain people, certain classes, over and above the entirety of Syrian society, which is one of the reasons why we had some sort of a popular uprising, even if Syria was not necessarily the leading member and it perhaps wasn't as ripe, perhaps, as others. We have reasons to believe that there was a horrendous several decades that resulted in the Syrian uprising. And that is something
which was an organic uprising?
Absolutely. In the beginning of the uprising in the Syrian case, and a lot of people would dispute that, and I don't know why they would dispute that, because you could actually see the Janus face of the Syrian uprising. It's insulting to assume that there are no reasons for people to rise up against a brutal repression that makes grown men and women piss in their pants when they get a call from mukhabarat or security services. It's insulting. However, as I've written and as I'm writing, the Syrian uprising, as a result of these other things, which is the other part of the Syrian uprising, the other face, as a result of that, it was transformed from a deep, profound desire for an alternative that is more democratic, that includes more freedoms, that includes the possibility of political organization. It transformed from that to a regional and probably an international power play in which Syrians did not matter, and in which, in my view, the enemies of what Syria is and the role that it has played in the region, even under problematic dictators or brutal leaderships, it actually became an arena in which, in my view, a lot of figures, a lot of states, and especially powerful states wanted to use to redraw the map of the region, which is precisely what we are seeing right now. The current government today started as a government led by HTS, controlled and dominated by HTS, where people had a kind of interesting way to look at, because they were wondering what is going on. Of course, we can talk about the Al-Qaeda lineage. And that's fine. But more importantly are the policies. And this, for me, over the past 9 months, and for many people, including Syrians who supported the uprising and who initially supported Ahmed al-Sharia and Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HDS, are now taking pause and actually pulling back, and began to think that what's happening right now is not what we thought was going to happen. And for that reason, many Syrians today are far less hopeful, if not hopeful, compared to the early days, or especially the first 2 months and before March.
But isn't that why the lineage is quite important? His alleged ties to the CIA, to Al-Qaeda. Mm-hmm. When you put that in the context of him being the same man who's currently flirting with normalization, who's essentially ceded the Golan Heights and further Syrian territory to Israel, who's cozying up to the US. We literally saw him at the UN General Assembly recently cracking jokes with a former CIA director who was previously hunting him down. Is this not relevant to what you're saying now, which is that the leadership also now appears to be doing what we've seen happen in the region time and time again, which is we have hope that a popular uprising will lead to change. We had the same experience in Egypt, and then eventually what we see is another leader who essentially continues to be in service to foreign powers.
The good thing about today's world is that you don't have to be conspiratorial. The question of normalization, the question of being in the bosom of the United States as a result of the Trump trip to Saudi Arabia and the trade-offs that are taking place, and much more that we can talk about, is evident. But let me just start with this idea that, isn't it odd? Because I would ask the question too, but in reality, it is not weird for the US to be connecting with a former Al-Qaeda member who was on the State Department hit list. The United States has done that many times in the past, including with Taliban prior to the 9/11 attacks. Having said that, yes, this past is important, despite the actual remake, right, the makeover that Ahmed al-Sharia himself or HTS tried to actually establish by changing names, trying to get on the good side of the international community. And now we see the sort of this campaign on acid. Despite that, we are seeing a very problematic way of running things in Syria, not early on, because early on, in fact, it's important to recognize, and I am half Syrian, I have family in Syria, even minorities in Syria were surprised that early on, there were no actual mass-based revenge campaigns, and people were somewhat ready to give even this personality and HTS a chance because Syrians are exhausted. So the problem in Syria started a couple of months into the assumption of HTS of power, and primarily in March, when there was supposed to be a deadline for the transitional phase, the first transitional phase. A few things happened that are important. The first is the announcement of a national dialogue prior to that was going to happen around March. And that was very disappointing because it wasn't really a dialogue among the various social forces in Syria. It was very much of an internal dialogue within HTS, peppered by other players. But those other players were not powerful social forces that were brought in. These were individuals that purportedly represented or did not represent others, including other minorities that are not Sunni and so on, which is what they were trying to celebrate. But it was very much of an internal affair. The second thing was the constitutional declaration that we that basically we witnessed in March, which basically created and opened the door and paved the way for the centralization of Syria's government within the hands of the leadership of Ahmed al-Sharia. Right? It was a kind of centralization that spoke of a really bad start for what's to come. It was kind of also akin to classic Arab dictators that basically are the president, the prime minister, the head of the military, and all of these other functions. And then, of course, the third thing that ended up sort of breaking the camel's back were the massacres in the coast that led to the killing of anywhere between 2,000 to 3,000 people. The big blow, in my view, and the view of many others that I respect who work on Syria, was the massacres in Sueda recently. The massacres in Sueda were of different nature. Sueda was not as armed, right, or organized as the folks in the coast, which actually have arms and have been previously organized in a particular way that is, antithetical to the current regime.
So tell us, just for those who aren't familiar with what happened in Sueda, can you just tell us what happened
Well,
there?
very quickly, Sueda is a province in Syria in the southern part that is predominantly inhabited by Druze, who are basically historically have been quite alert and aware and awake and resistant from the time of French colonialism and after. And in this particular case, they have been the victims of a campaign that is being viewed as a campaign by HTS against certain minorities that are likely not to, open doors for the path that HTS is taking, which is a very problematic path. Something that we've discovered, it's a very problematic path. Even if you anticipated it, we actually are seeing it, which is why I'm saying judge Ahmed al-Sharia and HTS and the leadership. Call it whatever you want, right?
Yeah.
Some people focus on Ahmed, some people focus on HTS, some people focus on Al-Qaeda, some people focus on the official former legal positions. Call it what you will. Judge it based on the policies. And the policies and the actions are in many ways more than disappointing for some, horrifying for others. In many ways, this massacre in Sueda was the other shoe. And in my view, At this point, I'm seeing online people that used to sort of support the uprising, whether or not it was led, and it was led, spearheaded on the battlefield by HTS and by groups that are similar to HTS in ideology and approach, that actually had departed from the original sentiments of the uprising in March 2011. Those people I'm seeing today are completely disillusioned, alienated, and now in direct opposition to what's happening in Syria today. So imagine if you already had seen HTS in its previous incarnation during the uprising, if you had seen it as suspect or problematic or basically counter-revolutionary even, imagine what these people inside Syria and outside Syria are feeling and seeing. Still, I really think that a lot of people expect a collapse. And I've talked to people that thought that I was being irrational when I, early on, the first couple of months, even after the third and fourth and fifth month, I shared that we're not going to necessarily see a collapse because a lot of governments in the region and the United States are invested in this regime because it defanged any opposition to Israel or to imperialism.
Why are they so invested?
Because this regime and the fact that its own potential capacities, even if there's a change of heart within the regime against Israel, which during the uprising we didn't see that, vociferous discourse against Israel.
There's
In
no
fact,
evidence.
It was clearly not the case. Israel, within 2 days of the collapse or the withering of the previous regime, destroyed 80% of Syria's military capacity, with not a peep from the entire world, including Turkey, including, of course, all the Arab countries, which are the lowest on the totem pole of morality. And that demonstrated that there was some sort of understanding or coordination, or call it what you will, between the United States, Israel, Turkey, various Arab countries. And some people say at that late stage, not early on, HTS itself, that this is going to have to be okay, and there are going to be trade-offs, one of which we saw in Trump's trip to Saudi Arabia, where sanctions were lifted, and that was announced as a major victory for the current regime. The question is, at what cost are sanctions lifted? And what does this portend for not just the future of Syria in terms of freedoms and so on, but also in terms of sovereignty? And that's my concern, that Syria today is a good ally for the West and for Israel, because it is either not capable or not willing to put up a fight against those who are usurping its own land.
I'm a big believer in people power. It's something we talk about a lot on this show. I think a lot of us have lost trust, whether in the East or in the West, in our government's ability to bring about the sort of change that we deem necessary. But, if we look at the region and the outcome of previous forms of uprising, whether in Egypt or whether in Syria now more recently, Tunisia and beyond, we don't exactly have a great blueprint for the popular uprisings translating into people-powered governance, I should say. And on top of that, just as it is for the people in the East, it's for the same for us here in the West. The forms of autocratic surveillance that are now at work. If we think back to the Egyptian uprisings, we remember the use of X, which was then Twitter, to coordinate, organizing. Much of that today will just be used to identify the troublemakers early on. And I suspect that much of our social media is simply being used today to form databases on who exactly needs to be stopped, quizzed and repressed for, causing strife, be it here or there, which is the interesting part. I mean, how much hope do you hold in those popular revolts? Can we really believe that at this time, with the amount of intensity of repression, with the levels of violence, with the levels of state intrusion and surveillance, that popular uprisings in the region can bring about true sovereignty for the people of the Arab world?
I am extremely hopeful.
Wow.
Absolutely. There is no escape. The question is about timing. And people who turn that hopeful sort of nature into an imminent revolt are sort of off mark, because this is a long game, and it's not going to end. Even if the next phase somewhat succeeds, it's not going to be the last phase. So we usually are egocentric human beings. So we think in our lifetimes, this is when things are going to be settled forever. And people thought about this for the past several thousand years, and it's not. It never will be. But it is also important not to lose sight of certain things, because people usually, those who would like to, advise caution, would keep saying that, oh, we've seen this before, this is going to happen and happen again, and it's been happening for decades. What people are not realizing are a few important geopolitical things that are taking place. First, the unrivaled dominance of the United States as a leader of a unipolar world that it leads is in transition, the transitional phase. Some people say it's over. I don't believe that. Some people say it hasn't begun. I also don't believe that. It's in a transitional phase. We don't know exactly where it is. Usually in the social sciences, if you are being serious and methodological, you've got to recognize where your ignorance lies. And our ignorance lies here, which is we cannot determine what phase it's in. So that is a structural change that is serious. The rise of China primarily, and of course India and other BRIC countries and so on, is significant because they are splitting the pie. Not necessarily militarily, because the United States is light years, if you can say that. It's way ahead of others on this count. But this structural change is taking place. The distance between leaderships and the populace for the first time in quite some time in the United States also reflects this dynamic, but also reflects the sort of removal of the veneer of liberalism. And you are being to see extremist movements in quotation marks developing in order to take advantage of this moment, either to make America great again or to restore something else. And all of this talk of restoration, in my view, is very problematic on both sides, because we don't want to restore anything in the past. The past of the United States is horrific, and we don't want to restore that. We would like to start something new, which is the reason why people in the United States are afraid, because this new thing is going to happen under a new kind of demographic that doesn't reflect a kind of dominance, whether it's class or race, that resembles what we had, which is precisely why these attacks on immigrants is taking place. The whole idea is to thin out in my view, the population that you can call it non-white, but you can call it, a population that is likely to not support the status quo as it is today, and will stand in the way of some sort of calling for a previous state of being. And we are seeing this at the same time that we are witnessing what's happening in Palestine with the genocide, which is much bigger than Palestine. So the Palestinian cause right now has become the cause, or the moral cause globally, that's not just about what Israel is doing in Palestine, but how Palestine is a laboratory for so many other things that are happening around the world, whether it's crazy configurations such as the building of private cities, which is taking place, and there are lots of reports on the building of private cities by tech moguls and business moguls who would like to escape the obstacles that are placed on actual nation states. They would like to figure something out that's outside this realm, whether it is climate change, and whether it is what I see as the biggest source of hope in the region and beyond, which is the new generation, or what is called Gen Z, or what's beyond it, which will not accept or has not accepted what is going on, actually. The difference between this generation and the newcomers to opposing genocide in the United States is that the newcomers are repulsed by the actions of Israel during the genocide. They're not repulsed by the actual racist, ethnic cleansing, military occupation and apartheid state that Israel has actually been described by, whether it's international human rights organizations or the people that are under its wrath, or observers. They're repulsed by the actions. They're not repulsed. They want to come back to an Israel without genocide, as though this was an original, beautiful state. It was actually quite the opposite all along.
It's a Netanyahu problem.
Absolutely. And then there's the Netanyahu or the Likud, and there is a complete ignorance of history where actually it was labor that has committed some of the worst atrocities. Opposed to that are the new generation and the Gen Z, the sons and daughters of these people, who are actually not just, against Israel because they have a kind of prejudice. They're against Israel based on its actions. And that's evidenced by the sons and daughter of American Jewry, which they feel they have lost, which is why they're trying to go back to social media in order to regain this entire populations, including the sons and daughters of Zionist families, Zionists, whether Jewish or not. So you are seeing a leadership that is actually disturbed by what is happening, and they're trying to buy their way back into reasserting their narrative, either via social media or by force on American streets, as we are seeing. And that's the difference between the new generation, which actually opposed what Israel was doing prior to the uprising, prior to the genocide. And this is the source of hope, one source of hope that I see, but also the kind of constellation of popular support for Palestine. Every single week, you, as much as I, see the support we see in Europe and the United States for Palestinian rights, which actually is translated into the debunking of this hegemony of Israel's narrative. These are positive things, hopeful things. I just don't think we're going to see their fruits very soon.
Is this the end of Zionism?
Right now, I don't think so. I think this is the last stage of Zionism, whereby it's going to survive on naked force. And that opens the door of whether it's going to be the end or not, because there are so many vested interests, as we are seeing. There is a huge part of American financial power that is Zionist, that is supportive of Israel, that is trying now to buy, with Larry Ellison buying CBS, TikTok, CNN, and other ventures to actually revive specifically what Larry Ellison said in a quick interview, to basically support not just Israel, right? The IDF, because he's the biggest, he prides himself on being the biggest supporters of the IDF. So there is a lot of support, but that support is now actually bringing a negative reputation to both these people and to Israel. And it's going to fuel the movement, even within MAGA, Make America Great Again, or Genocide, again, I don't know which one. It's going to fuel that support against basically this Israel first approach and for another America first approach. And I wouldn't put so much behind the new voices that are opposed to Israel, because they're opposed to Israel because Israel has actually violated every single shred of human and moral decency. But what they envision also, and what they have said before, whether it's Marjorie Taylor Greene or Tucker Carlson, is not good for Americans, ordinary Americans, and is actually repulsive in its own right.
Thank you. It's something that I've talked about a fair bit on this show, this idea of these new alliances with these right-wing figures who somehow, intersect with us on Palestine, but actually, if we strengthen them through support on this issue, I'm not sure that once this corner is turned, that we really want to follow them down whatever route that they'll be taking us down after that. So
Johnny come lately intersection, though. Yeah.
Right. Bassam Haddad, thank you so much for joining us on The Tea.
Thank you for having me. I'm very happy to be with you again, and all power to you.
Thank you so much. And thank you for tuning in to another episode of The Tea. If this conversation gave you something to think about, hit that subscribe button, share the episode, and join the conversation on Patreon, link in our bio. And for our top tier patrons, you get ad-free episodes up close and uninterrupted. We are committed to providing fact-based, truthful, and independent journalism at a time when the truth is under assault globally. But independence has a cost. To keep delivering uncensored, unbought reporting, we need your support. Remember, challenging power starts with curiosity and courage, two things our community shows week after week. So stay awake, stay engaged, and never stop digging for the truth. Until next time, keep the conversation alive in the comments below. Thanks for tuning into The Tea. If this episode resonated with you, drop a comment and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And why not dive into these other episodes that we think you'll love? Let's keep the conversation going.